Hello, my name is Jesse Gallagher, and I'd like to talk about a project that I created last year on OpenNTF, and which recently 23 hours ago, had a 2.0 release, and it's the NSF ODB Tooling. The name is, it's a little functional, but the idea of this is that it gives you capabilities when working with Maven and Eclipse with dealing with an on-disk project version of an NSF. So when you have, when you're setting up an NSF for source control in Designer, you create an on-disk project and you use Designer to sync back and forth between the NSF and the on-disk project. And this works well enough for source control. But this project was born out of my frustrations with working with one of my larger XPages projects, which has a number of plugins and a number of databases to compile. And the process of creating a release out of this was difficult. I would have to go and make sure each of the databases was up to date, which was properly compiled, making sure that Designer actually compiled the classes, which sometimes it may or may not, and then creating a template, marking it with the right template build, the template build date, all of these little things that go into it got very tedious. So I wanted to automate this process more. So there was an existing capability, there still is an existing capability in Designer to do a headless build. And Christian Gudeman made a very good plugin, very similar to some of the capabilities of this, to automate that process. However, there are a couple downsides with that. One is that it requires running on Windows. So you need to have, because Designer is only on Windows, it required a Windows installation. It required this to be run in a Windows environment. Another problem is that the way that Designer was automated was extremely unreliable in practice. Sometimes it would work fine, but a lot of the times it would just kind of sit there for a while, and then by necessity, the code controlling it had to do timeouts and check, has Designer done anything yet? And so it would very frequently fail. And so it ended up being not really a great solution for doing this. So what I did was I created an NSF and XPages compiler, building on existing code, especially from the Bazaar, that compiles these and will work behind the scenes. And so this will work without Designer. Originally, it at least required a Domino server, which is still a way to set it up. But at the very least, it requires either a Domino server or a local Notes or Domino installation, but it does not require Windows. It does not require Designer. And so this has a couple capabilities. Before I go into the individual things that you can do with it, I want to talk about and show an example project that I have in the repository for this. So this is an example project showing kind of my standard structure for how I do a OSGI XPages plugin, and now with NSFs inside of it. So this is kind of using a very common layout among Tyco-based OSGI projects with Maven, where you'll have your bundles and your features, and here it's reling for release engineering. And this is where you'll have your update site and final distribution. To this, I added NSF directory. So you have all this structured. In a lot of my cases, there'll be many more projects involved, many more bundles, and so it will be much more complicated. But this shows kind of like the minimal canonical version of you have a plugin, you have a feature, you have an update site, you have an NSF, and then optionally you have a distribution project that brings all of this together. And so each of these is pretty much what you'd expect. And so you can see, all right, they're all brought into Maven. It's not too hard to bring an ODP into Eclipse by default, but there are certainly some differences here. To start with, I'll just show it in action. So I'll do a run as Maven install. And so this will, if you're familiar with Maven, which this kind of presupposes, this will go through the project. And as you see it go, you can see now it's building the example NSF. And I'll scroll back up to this, where you can see here are the steps that it's going through. So it sees, this was requested to install a bundle. So the idea is that this NSF that uses the code from the plugin that we've provided. And so it installs that in a local runtime. It initializes all of the appropriate environment, it compiles the Java classes, it compiles the XPages and custom controls, and then it creates all these things, and then also imports all of any legacy design elements, so forms, views, script libraries, navigators, web service consumers, all those things are covered, and they are imported in. The Lotus script is compiled, and because it's running locally with the local notes ID, it's compiled as whatever the user is. So for example, I have it set up so that I have a build server that has a specialized build ID. And so that way it's all compiled and signed with the appropriate ID there, so that takes away one of the little annoying bits of like, well, do I want to sign my templates with a certain thing? Like, well, if you're building them with that ID, they're already signed. So it goes through this process, and then it ends up creating an NSF. So if I kind of skip to the end here of my distribution project, so if you're not familiar with distribution projects in Maven, this is using the Maven assembly plugin. And what this does is it gives you capabilities to bring together all of your project artifacts. So different plugins, in this case, the update site and the NSF. And so if I open up the zip here, you can see it brought in the license, which is important. It brought in the NSF, so this is the freshly compiled NSF, and then it brought in the update site. So this is a smaller version of one of the things that I hand off to my client to say, hey, here is the latest build of the entire thing. So it has all of the update site, there are 2 update sites on that one, all of the NSFs, additional deployment jars if necessary, all of these additional things. It's a nice way to package all this together. And because now the NSF is included, this is all part of a deployment of a build process that I don't even need to be there for. So it really helps bring the NSF kind of into the line with all of the other projects and all of the other, we'll say best practices. So that's all nice and good. So there's the compiler there. I'll talk next a little bit while I'm here about some of the enhancements that I've been making to the Eclipse side. So, it's all well and good to have a wrapping project for the NSF in Eclipse, but that's still not going to be the same as Designer. So Designer has extra capabilities as far as actually working with design elements and working with X pages, and this does not replicate all of that because that is a tremendous amount of work, but it replicates some of it. So if you expand a NSF project here, you see I've added in these different design element categories in the same ordering and the same grouping as in Designer. So other than this, where you'll have your Java code and resources, which are coming, these are coming from an Xpages environment. You'll also have your views, and you see here your Xpages and custom controls and shared elements. This specific database doesn't have too much, but it has all of those elements. And one of the immediate enhancements, particularly if you're dealing with Xpages, is that the way that this imports into Eclipse is that it ties it together with all of the standard plugin development environment in Eclipse. So if you have your plugin in there, this will create dependencies from your NSF onto that plugin, so it sees the classes. So for example, if I go in here, I can see, well, this is just an example class that's being compiled, but I can see in my example here, there's an example library, so I think I should be able to access that. Yeah, .class. So I can't really do much with this, but it's saying this is a class that's over here in the example library. And so if I have a lot of extra utility classes or shared classes, this makes Eclipse know about those relationships. So if you refactor something in a plugin, it's affected in the NSF downstream. And so it knows about all of this stuff, and it knows about the dependencies. And so it builds a full dependency workspace hierarchy for interacting with all of this stuff. And so it has all of the standard classes you'd expect to find, like in Designer, as well as any of your custom plugins that you're bringing in. For other design elements, there aren't editors for all of these because that's the large amount of work. But it does bring in the XML schemas. So at the very least, you can see here, this is the DXL version of a view note, and then it has options for saying it knows about what the different classes that you can do for this are, what the different options for if it's the default version of this design note. This is something that I plan to build upon in the future, but at the very least now you have effectively an enhanced DXL editor inside Eclipse, quote unquote, for free. I wouldn't probably spend a lot of time editing my design elements as XML in here other than the Xpages, but it's there and it is something that's now possible, which would have been a little more difficult before. And so that covers, you can bring in, it brings in extra knowledge about it. If you can reference external jars, for example, we have a lot of projects where it assumes that things are being deployed to JVM lib ext, for example, if they're also being used by agents or something like that. In the configuration for the plugin, you have the option to say, I also want to point to these other jar files, say in my repository or somewhere else. And then it brings them in both during the compilation process, but also in here, they would show up under plugin dependencies as well. So if you have these extra dependencies on extra class path jars like that, you can work with those directly. The last thing I would like to show is I'd like to bring up a terminal here, and I'll go to the example project directory and go to NSF example, and this is the the ability to generate an on-disk project out of the original code. So here I have this, and so I'll say, all right, copy the target this to here. And we'll have a nice little working directory here where we just have an NSF and blank. And so I want to do NSF ODP. And then point to this file. And what this is going to do is take the NSF. And so this is the reverse of the compilation process. So this is going to take the NSF and export from that. Oh, that's the... Oh, I see. I know what the problem is. Because I'm not working in a full project directory, I have to spell out org.opentf.maven. NSF ODP. No, it's Maven. NSF ODP Maven plugin version 2. And then here it will say, okay, well, now it knows what plugin I'm talking about, and that's just the case there. Now it's saying generating on disk project for that database. And now I have an ODP directory. And if I do find on that, you'll see this generates the same kind of ODP that Designer does. So where in Designer you would say team development, create new on disk project, here it does the same thing. And this is Designer compatible XML. It creates the project file. It creates, if there are settings in there, it exports custom controls and the metadata classes. And this is meant to be a much, much nicer and more consistent way of exporting a project onto ODP. So in this way, you could, in theory, do NSF development, taking a starting NSF or creating a new one, writing it in Eclipse, and then never having Designer involved at all, especially if the editors expand. So this is kind of a baseline for building this, but in the future it may be a fully fledged kind of quote unquote Designer replacement. But for now, the primary thrust of being able to generate ODPs, which is something that I also have to do on a regular basis, where another developer who is not on board with doing source control modifies an NSF, I want to include it in the main source control, and so I can export it with this rather than having to open it up in Designer and resync with the team development controls, which can also be hit or miss. So it covers that, and it also covers the main process of saying I want to just have an NSF and have it part of this whole thing. So I found this to be immensely useful. It saved me a tremendous amount of time in my development lately. It takes off a lot of hassle. It makes my builds of NSFs much, much more reliable because it's no longer dependent on whether or not I remembered to hit F5 on all of the right parts of the NSF to kick Designer into compiling it. And it just makes things much nicer, and it brings things together, and it also opens up doors for performing additional Maven-based actions on this. So I have other things in mind for how I want to enhance this, bringing in Maven dependencies, bringing in other things. But this is one of the major steps that I think is important if you want to start taking your NSF development out of Designer and bringing it further into the, like we'll say the real world, the larger world of Java and other development, by making the on-disk project a smaller part of it and a component of a tree of projects. You gain a lot of control over it, you gain a lot of abilities, and I think that this is going to be one of the primary ways that we can kind of move away from the Designer-focused method of working with NSFs and working and use this to build more reliable projects and more complicated projects and projects with better tooling and other new technologies. So I think this is definitely worth checking out. If you have any questions, you can ask them on the OpenNTF page or the GitHub page, or find me on Twitter at Gidgerby, GIDGERBY. Thank you.